Here is a fact that should stop you in your tracks. In the years just before the American Revolution, the people who would go on to overthrow the British crown were among the least taxed human beings anywhere in the Western world. The average person living in Britain paid roughly 26 shillings a year to the treasury. The average colonist in America paid about one shilling. In some colonies, it was less than half of that. So when you hear that the American Revolution was a tax revolt, that a group of overburdened, oppressed farmers finally snapped under the crushing weight of British taxation, I want you to hold that number in your mind because it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit at all. The story most of us grew up with is clean and satisfying: a greedy king, a distant parliament. No taxation without representation. Tea tossed into a harbor. A ragtag band of patriots standing up to the most powerful empire on earth in the name of liberty. It's a story that fits on a bumper sticker, and that is exactly why it has survived for 2.5 centuries. But it is not the story the evidence tells. When you actually follow the money, the land, the debt, and the quiet self-interest of the men whose names are carved into marble today, you find a revolution that is stranger, messier, and far more human than the one in the textbooks. Because the American Revolution was not really born in a fit of righteous anger over a tea tax. It was born in the aftermath of a world war that nobody in America paid for. It was born in a line drawn on a map that blocked the richest speculators in the colonies from the fortune they believed was theirs. It was born in the ledgers of tobacco planters who owed staggering sums to merchants in London and Glasgow. It was born in the smuggling wharves of Boston, in a corporate bailout of the world's largest company, in a courtroom in England that terrified slaveholders, and in a genuine, sincere, and in some ways paranoid belief that a conspiracy was underway to strip free men of their liberty. So let me walk you through what actually happened, not the pageant, the machinery underneath it. Because once you see how all of these forces fit together, the 4th of July stops being a fairy tale and becomes something much more interesting, a collision of interests, fears, debts, and ideas that no single cause can explain. Let's begin where the real story begins, which is not in 1776 and not even in 1770. It begins in the smoke of a war that most Americans today barely remember. The war that lit the fuse between 1754 and 1763. Britain and France fought a struggle so vast that it is sometimes called the First True World War. In Europe, it's known as the 7 Years' War. In America, it went by a different name, the French and Indian War. It was fought across multiple continents and oceans, and when the smoke cleared, Britain had won an empire of almost unimaginable scale. France was expelled from mainland North America. Britain now controlled territory from the Atlantic seaboard clear to the Mississippi River and up into Canada. But victory came with a bill, and the bill was catastrophic. Britain's national debt roughly doubled during the war, climbing from around £75 million to about £133 million by 1763. To grasp how enormous that was, consider this. The interest payments alone on that debt swallowed up more than half of the entire British government's budget. The empire had won the war and nearly bankrupted itself doing it. Now put yourself in the shoes of the men running the British government in the 1760s. You have just spent a fortune defending your American colonies from the French. You have thousands of soldiers still stationed in North America to keep the peace on a dangerous frontier. Your own citizens back home in England are taxed nearly to the breaking point. Land taxes, window taxes, excise duties on the everyday goods of ordinary life. There were even cider taxes that sparked riots in the English countryside. And across the ocean sits a population of colonists who are, by the standards of the age, prospering. American incomes were among the highest in the world. And these colonists were paying almost nothing toward the cost of the very war that had secured their safety. From London, the conclusion seemed not just reasonable, but obvious. The Americans should pay their share. Not the whole cost, just a fraction. A contribution toward their own defense. That is the seed from which everything else grew. Every act, every tax, every crisis that followed traces back to this single problem. An empire drowning in war debt, looking across the Atlantic at a lightly taxed and wealthy population, and deciding it was time for them to pitch in. This is the piece the popular story skips. It jumps straight to the outrage, the mobs, the slogans, the tea, as if the colonists rose up against taxes that fell out of a clear blue sky. But those taxes were not arbitrary cruelty. They were a desperate empire trying to pay off a war, And understanding that changes the entire meaning of what came next. The paradox of the lightly taxed rebels. So Parliament went to work. First came the Sugar Act of 1764, which actually lowered the duty on molasses, but paired that lower rate with real aggressive enforcement because the old higher duty had simply been smuggled around for decades. Then came the Currency Act, restricting the paper money the colonies could print. And then, in 1765, the act that turned grumbling into fury, the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act required that a huge range of printed materials in the colonies carry a stamp showing a tax had been paid. Newspapers, legal documents, licenses, contracts, even playing cards. And here's what made it explosive. It wasn't a tax on trade, tucked away in the price of imported goods where you might not even notice it. It was a direct, internal tax, right in your face, touching lawyers, merchants, printers, and tavern keepers. Precisely the loud, literate, well-connected people best equipped to organize resistance. The colonial reaction was immediate and ferocious. Mobs formed. Stamp distributors were threatened, some of them hanged in effigy, a few driven from their homes. Delegates from 9 colonies met in New York at what became known as the Stamp Act Congress, and a slogan crystallized that we still repeat today: no taxation without representation. But here is where you have to slow down and think carefully, because this is where the myth quietly rewrites history. When we hear no taxation without representation, we naturally assume the problem was that the taxes were unbearable. They were not. Remember the numbers. The colonists were among the least taxed people in the empire. The Stamp Act, even at its worst, would not have impoverished anyone. So if the money itself was trivial, what were they actually fighting about? They were fighting about a principle and a precedent. The colonists had governed and taxed themselves through their own elected assemblies for well over a century. That was the entire arrangement they understood themselves to live under. Local matters, including money raised from local people, were decided by local representatives. Now Parliament, a body 3,000 miles away, in which not a single American had a seat, was claiming the authority to reach directly into their pockets. And the fear was not this one tax. The fear was, if they can do this, what can't they do? If Parliament can tax us a little without our consent, it can tax us a lot. The precedent was the danger. Concede the principle, and you had conceded everything. The British had an answer to this, and it's worth understanding because it reveals just how deep the gap had grown. British officials argued that the colonists were virtually represented in Parliament. The idea was that members of Parliament represented the interests of the entire empire, not just the specific district that elected them. So Americans were represented in spirit even if they couldn't vote. To Americans, this was nonsense, an insult dressed up as a theory. And frankly, it wasn't a great argument even at home, because at the time, only around 3% of British men could actually vote for Parliament at all. Parliament eventually backed down and repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, but it did something on the way out that is easy to overlook and impossible to overstate. On the very same day it repealed the tax, it passed the Declaratory Act, which asserted that Parliament had the full authority to make laws binding the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Read that phrase again. In all cases whatsoever. Parliament gave up the tax, but it planted a flag on the principle. And that principle, who ultimately holds sovereign power over these 3 million people, is the real fault line of the entire revolution. It was never really about the price of tea. It was about who gets to decide. The land nobody talks about. Now I want to take you somewhere the standard story almost never goes. Because while the arguments over taxes were raging up and down the coast, another grievance was quietly burning inland, and it may have done more to turn wealthy, powerful, respectable colonists into revolutionaries than any tax ever did. It was about land, specifically Western land. Cast your mind back to 1763, the year the war ended. Britain now owned that enormous stretch of territory west of the Appalachian Mountains, all the way to the Mississippi. To colonial elites, this was the opportunity of a lifetime. That western land meant fortunes, vast tracts to be bought cheap, surveyed, and resold to the flood of settlers pushing westward. Some of the most prominent men in America had already sunk money into land speculation companies betting on exactly this. And then London slammed the door. In the proclamation of 1763, King George III forbade colonial settlement beyond the Appalachian Ridge. From the British point of view, it was a sensible, even humane decision. They had just fought a brutal, expensive war. The frontier was dangerous. Native nations in the Ohio Valley, the Shawnee, the Delaware, the Iroquois, and others were powerful, organized, and absolutely determined to defend their homelands, as an uprising known as Pontiac's War made bloodily clear that very year. Britain, deep in debt, had no appetite to pay for another frontier war so that speculators could get rich. So the crown drew a line and said, "Not past here." Now look at who that line hurt. George Washington was a Virginia land speculator with thousands of acres of ambitions and claims to western tracts. Some of them promised to him and his fellow veterans as payment for their service in the war. Thomas Jefferson speculated in western land. So did Patrick Henry. So did George Mason, who had invested in tens of thousands of acres beyond the mountains. Benjamin Franklin was involved in western land schemes. These are not minor figures. These are the names on the founding documents. And the proclamation of 1763 stood directly between them and the wealth they believed was theirs by right. Washington himself privately dismissed the proclamation as a temporary measure that a savvy man should look past, and he kept quietly maneuvering to secure western land anyway. He called it a mistake to pass up the chance to grab good land. This is not the marble Washington of the monuments. This is a shrewd, ambitious real estate investor who saw a British policy standing between him and a fortune, and who never forgot it. Historians like Woody Holton have argued powerfully that in a colony like Virginia, you simply cannot understand the road to revolution without understanding land and debt. The proclamation of 1763 and later the Quebec Act of 1774, which handed much of that coveted Western territory to the administration of Quebec, struck directly at the financial interests of the most influential planters in America. One Virginia leader called the Quebec Act the worst grievance of them all. Think about that. Not the tea, not the stamps, the land. And there's a dimension here that our patriotic retellings almost entirely erase, one that Holton and others insist we confront. Native Americans were not scenery in this story. They were not passive obstacles waiting to be swept aside. They were determined, capable nations who fought effectively to hold their territory. And it was partly because they fought so effectively that Britain drew the proclamation line in the first place. The revolution, in other words, was shaped in part by the successful resistance of the very peoples that American history so often reduces to a footnote. The men who would sign the Declaration of Independence wanted that Western land badly, and the two things standing in their way were the native nations who lived on it and the British Crown that was trying, for its own reasons, to keep the peace. Follow the money. Let's follow another thread, because the American Revolution is one of those events where nearly every grievance, when you tug on it, turns out to be tied to somebody's balance sheet. And I don't say that to be cynical. I say it because it's the part of the story that gets sanded away, and it's the part that makes these people human instead of statues. Start with smuggling. For generations, colonial merchants had grown wealthy by ignoring British trade laws, importing molasses, sugar, wine, and other goods from wherever they pleased, duties be damned. Smuggling wasn't a shameful secret, it was the backbone of the New England economy. And one of the greatest smugglers of the age was a young Boston merchant who inherited a fortune built substantially on evading the duty on French molasses. His name was John Hancock. Yes, that John Hancock, the man whose signature is so bold on the Declaration of Independence that his name became slang for a signature. Now, when Britain got serious after 1763 about actually collecting its revenue, it went after exactly this world. Customs officers were empowered with writs of assistance, general search warrants that let them enter warehouses and even homes hunting for smuggled goods without naming what they were looking for. Smuggling cases were pulled out of local colonial courts where sympathetic neighbors sitting on juries reliably acquitted the accused and moved to vice admiralty courts where a single crown-appointed judge decided the verdict with no jury at all. To a Boston merchant, this wasn't abstract tyranny. This was the government coming for his livelihood and stripping away the legal protections that had always shielded him. Suddenly, high-minded talk about the rights of Englishmen and the sanctity of trial by jury had a very concrete meaning for the wealthiest men in the port cities. Then there's the debt of the great planters. In the tobacco colonies, Virginia, Maryland, the plantation aristocracy lived lavishly, but much of that lifestyle ran on credit extended by merchants in London and in Glasgow. Planters shipped their tobacco across the Atlantic, bought British luxury goods on credit against the next crop, and rolled the debt forward year after year. Many of them, including some of the most famous names of the Revolution, were chronically deeply in debt to British creditors. Jefferson, for one, was entangled in debt for much of his life. When you owe a great deal of money to merchants in the mother country, and when the entire imperial system seems designed to keep you dependent and in the red, the idea of breaking free from that system carries a certain financial appeal that historians have long noted, even if the founders themselves rarely admitted it aloud. And this brings us at last to the tea, because the real story of the Boston Tea Party is almost the opposite of what we've been taught. We imagine it as a protest against a cruel new tax. But the Tea Act of 1773 didn't raise the tax on tea, it actually made tea cheaper. Here's what was really going on. The British East India Company, the largest and most powerful corporation on earth, a company that ran armies and governed millions in India, was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. It was, in the language of our own time, too big to fail. So Parliament passed the Tea Act to rescue it, granting the company the right to ship its tea directly to the colonies and sell it through its own agents, undercutting everyone else. Read that carefully because it's a corporate bailout. Parliament propped up a failing mega corporation by handing it a monopoly on the colonial tea market. And that monopoly threatened to wipe out colonial merchants, including, of course, all the smugglers who had been importing cheaper Dutch tea. So the men who dumped that tea into Boston Harbor on the night of December 16, 1773, around 342 chests of it worth something like 9,000 to 18,000 pounds, a genuine fortune, were protesting a tax, yes, but they were also protesting a monopoly that endangered their businesses and a principle they refused to concede. Political conviction and economic self-interest were braided together so tightly you could not pull them apart. That's not a flaw in the story. That is the story. Britain's response to the Tea Party is what finally tipped everything toward war. Parliament passed a series of punishing laws the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, closing the port of Boston until the tea was paid for, gutting Massachusetts' self-government, and more. And in doing so, Britain accidentally accomplished what the colonial radicals had never managed on their own. It united the colonies. Massachusetts was no longer alone. If Parliament could crush one colony's liberties like this, it could crush any of them. The other. Colonies rallied and the First Continental Congress convened in 1774. The road to Lexington and Concord was now open. The uncomfortable thread. Now I need to take you into the hardest and most contested part of this story, and I want to be careful and honest about it because historians genuinely disagree here, and you deserve the real debate rather than a tidy answer. The uncomfortable thread is slavery, and the role that protecting it may have played in pushing some colonists toward revolution. In 1772, a court case in England sent a tremor through the American colonies. It's known as Somerset's case. A judge named Lord Mansfield ruled that an enslaved man named James Somerset could not be forcibly removed from England and sold back into slavery in the colonies, because slavery had no foundation in English common law. Now, the ruling was actually narrow, and it did not abolish slavery across the British Empire, but its symbolism was enormous, and it was widely understood and widely feared as a sign that the tide in Britain was turning against slavery. To a wealthy planter in Virginia or South Carolina, whose entire fortune was built on enslaved human beings, that was a deeply alarming signal about where the mother country might be heading. Then, in November of 1775, came a moment that turned that fear into fury. Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation offering freedom to any enslaved person who fled a rebel master and joined the British forces. Thousands took him up on it. For Virginia slaveholders, this was the nightmare made real. The British Crown, their supposed sovereign, was now actively arming and freeing the people they held in bondage. It radicalized the Virginia gentry almost overnight and helped push a wavering colony firmly into the arms of revolution. The historian Gerald Horne has argued, provocatively, that fear for the future of slavery was a significant driving force behind the revolution, that some colonists rebelled in part to protect the institution from a British Empire that seemed increasingly willing to threaten it. This is a serious argument, and it deserves to be heard. It's also genuinely contested. Many historians push back, pointing out that abolition in Britain was still years away, that Somerset's case was legally limited, and that the causes of the revolution were tangled and varied across 13 very different colonies. Slavery's role was surely larger in Virginia and the Carolinas than in, say, Massachusetts. What is not seriously in dispute is the aching contradiction sitting at the very center of it all. The men who wrote that all people are created equal and endowed with the right to liberty were, many of them, holding hundreds of human beings in bondage as they wrote it. Jefferson, who penned those words, enslaved more than 600 people over his lifetime. That contradiction was not lost on everyone at the time. The essayist Samuel Johnson in England asked with acid contempt how it was that the loudest cries for liberty came from the men who drove slaves. The Revolution was a genuine fight for liberty. It was also, at the same moment, a fight waged in part by men determined to protect their power to deny liberty to others. Both of those things are true, and the history is not honest until it holds them together. The idea that made men march so far, I've given you debt, land, smuggling, monopoly, and slavery, the material machinery underneath the revolution. But if I stopped there, I'd be committing the opposite error from the textbooks, because the ideas were real too. And the great historian Bernard Bailyn spent a career showing us just how real they were. Bailyn did something ingenious. He went and read the pamphlets, the thousands of cheap, furious political pamphlets that colonists actually wrote and read in the years before the war. And what he found was that these people were not cynically inventing high-minded excuses for their financial interests. They genuinely, sincerely believed something specific and frightening, that there was a deliberate conspiracy underway centered in London to strip them of their liberties and reduce them to slaves, political slaves, subjects with no rights at all. To us sitting here today, that can sound paranoid, but you have to understand the intellectual world they lived in. Colonial Americans were steeped in a tradition of political thought, inherited from radical English writers, that was obsessed with the fragility of liberty and the endless hunger of power to devour it. In that worldview, free peoples did not usually lose their freedom in one dramatic blow. They lost it gradually through a series of small encroachments, each one seemingly minor, each one setting a precedent for the next, until one day the people looked up and found the chains already on. A standing army stationed among them in peacetime, taxes imposed without consent, judges made dependent on the crown, trials moved away from juries, charters revoked. To a mind trained to watch for the slow creep of tyranny, these weren't unrelated annoyances. They were a pattern. They were evidence of a plot. And this is the key that unlocks the whole thing. The material grievances and the ideological fears were not two competing explanations. They were the same phenomenon seen from two sides. The tax on tea was, in itself, trivial, but viewed through the lens of the conspiracy against liberty, it became proof of a design. The writs of assistance were a threat to a merchant's bottom line, and also proof of a design. The proclamation line was a barrier to a speculator's fortune, and also proof that a distant power meant to hem them in and keep them small. The ideas gave meaning to the interests, and the interests gave urgency to the ideas. Take away either one and the revolution doesn't happen. The revolution that almost wasn't. Before I bring this home, I want to puncture one last myth, maybe the most important one of all, the myth of inevitability. The way we tell the story now, independence rolls forward like destiny, a united people marching as one toward a foregone conclusion. None of that is true. Start with the united people part. The colonists were never united. A large share of them wanted nothing to do with rebellion. Historians estimate that somewhere around a fifth of colonists remained loyal to the crown. The loyalists, real people who believed just as sincerely that their duty and their interests lay with Britain. Many thousands of them fought against the revolution, and after the war, tens of thousands fled the country they had lost. Another large chunk of the population simply wanted to be left alone and tried to stay neutral as long as they possibly could. The revolution was, among other things, a civil war. Neighbor against neighbor, sometimes family against family. And even among those who opposed British policy, independence was a radical and frightening leap that most were slow to take. Well into 1775, after blood had already been spilled at Lexington and Concord, the majority position was still reconciliation. They wanted their rights restored within the empire. They wanted to be Britons again, treated fairly. Breaking away entirely to stand alone against the mightiest power on earth seemed to many like madness. What changed their minds was not inevitability. It was a cascade of specific events and, crucially, a single pamphlet. In January of 1776, an English immigrant named Thomas Paine published Common Sense, and it did something no one had quite managed before. It argued in plain, blistering, accessible language that the whole idea of monarchy was absurd, that it made no sense for a vast continent to be ruled by a distant island, and that independence was not just possible, but common sense. It sold in staggering numbers and moved public opinion faster than perhaps any piece of writing in American history. It helped make thinkable what had been unthinkable only months before. Remove Paine's pamphlet or Dunmore's proclamation or the specific overreach of the Intolerable Acts or any number of other contingent sparks, and the timeline bends. The break might have come later or softer or not at all in the form we know. History did not have to run this way. It ran this way because a particular sequence of pressures, decisions, fears, and accidents converged at a particular moment, and the men caught in that moment made choices they could have made differently. What it all really means. So let's pull the threads together because this is the part that actually matters. The American Revolution did not have a single cause, and anyone who tells you it did is selling you a slogan, not history. It was a cascade. It began with a world war that left the British Empire buried under debt and searching for someone to help pay it off. It ran through a lightly taxed, but proudly self-governing people who cared far less about the amount of the tax than about the terrifying principle behind it, the claim of a distant parliament to bind them in all cases whatsoever. It ran through Western land and the fortunes that powerful men saw blocked by a line on a map. It ran through the smuggling wharves and the merchant houses and the debt-ridden ledgers of the tobacco gentry. It ran through a corporate bailout dressed up as a tea tax. It ran through the deep and ugly fear in the plantation colonies that the crown might one day threaten the institution of slavery itself. And it ran through a sincere, burning, half-paranoid conviction that liberty was under coordinated attack and had to be defended before it was lost forever. No single one of these forces was enough on its own. The taxes alone were too small to start a war. The land grievance alone was too narrow. The ideas alone, without material threats to give them teeth, might have stayed on the page. But together, feeding on one another, magnifying one another, they became unstoppable. That is what most tellings get wrong. Not the facts. The facts are mostly right. It's the shape of the story. They pick one clean thread and pull it out and hold it up and say, this is why. And in doing so, they turn a vast, tangled human catastrophe of competing interests and genuine ideals into a children's fable with heroes and villains and a moral at the end. The real people were more complicated than that and more interesting. They were idealists who wrote some of the most powerful words about human freedom ever composed. They were also land speculators, smugglers, debtors, and slaveholders protecting their interests. They were both at once, and they mostly didn't see the contradiction. And where they did see it, they usually looked away. That doesn't make the ideals fake. The ideals were real, and they outlived the flawed men who spoke them. And they went on to inspire abolitionists and suffragists and movements for freedom the founders never imagined and would sometimes have been horrified by. That's the strange gift of the American Revolution, that its language of liberty turned out to be bigger and truer than the men who first spoke it. And here's why any of this should matter to you, sitting here all these centuries later. Because the instinct to flatten history into a simple story, good guys, bad guys, one cause, one moral, is not just a problem for the 18th century. It's how we misunderstand our own time, too. Real events, the ones that actually shape the world, almost never have one cause. They are cascades. They are collisions of money and fear and principle and accident, driven by people who are usually convinced they're acting on pure motives, even when their interests are quietly steering the wheel. If you can learn to see that in the American Revolution, to hold the noble idea and the balance sheet in the same hand without letting go of either, then you can start to see it everywhere. And that, more than any date or battle, is the real lesson buried in the true origin of the American Revolution. If this changed the way you see the story you thought you knew, do me a favor, hit that like button, and subscribe if you're not already. Because this channel is all about digging beneath the tidy versions of history to find what actually happened underneath. Drop a comment and tell me, which of these forces do you think mattered most? The debt, the land, the money, or the ideas? I read everyone. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.